In Atlanta's muggy courthouse, Lena Harris, a poised black woman in a sleek blazer, marched toward her office expecting a calm day as chief clerk, when Officer Carl Grayson, a hulking white cop, seized her arm, growling, "Get out! You don't belong!" yanking her across the slick marble floor. Papers scattered, her coffee splashed, and she flashed her badge. Chief Clerk Harris. Grayson's jaw dropped, his grip loosening, a power flip igniting, but his eyes darkened. What desperate move would he pull to erase this moment that could ruin him forever? Before we dive into this wild tale, tell us where you're watching from. If you're all about justice kicking corruption's ass, hit like, subscribe, and join us for more raw truth. Let's expose the fight together. The Atlanta courthouse lobby pulsed with a sticky summer heat as Lena Harris stood rooted to the slick marble floor. Her sleek blazer torn at the sleeve where Officer Carl Grayson had grabbed her, coffee pooling in dark splotches around her scuffed heels, the bitter aroma mixing with the stale tang of sweat and old polish in the air, and her arm throbbed, a dull ache radiating from where his meaty fingers had dug in, leaving faint red marks against her deep brown skin. But she held her ground, chin high, her badge still clutched in her steady hand, its metallic gleam catching the flickering overhead lights, a defiant beacon against the chaos she'd just endured. Grayson loomed over her, a hulking figure in his crisp blue uniform, his broad chest heaving, his buzz cut glistening with a sheen of perspiration under the lobby's harsh fluorescence, and his thick neck flushed red, his snarl twisting into something uglier as the shock of her title sank in, his pale grey eyes darting from the badge to her face, disbelief warring with a fury he couldn't mask, and he barked, "You're snooping in restricted files," his voice booming across the lobby, a fabricated charge spilling from his lips like venom, his meaty hand still hovering near her arm as if itching to grab her again, because the sight of Chief Clerk Harris etched in gold had flipped his world, a black woman in power shattering his brittle assumptions, and he wouldn't let it stand. Clerks froze mid-step, their pens stilled over clipboards, their murmurs swallowed by the echo of his accusation, while bystanders gawked, some craning necks from behind glass partitions, others clutching briefcases with wide eyes. The bustle of the courthouse grinding to a halt, as if the air itself held its breath. And Lena's pulse hammered, her throat tightening, but she straightened her spine. "I'm Chief Clerk, check my clearance." Her words crisp, cutting through his bluster, because 32 years of clawing her way up from Atlanta's forgotten corners had taught her to stand tall when men like him tried to push her down, and she wouldn't flinch. Not here, not now. Grayson's lips curled, a sneer baring his uneven teeth. "Don't play smart with me," his growl low, menacing, and he shoved her toward the booking hall, his boots thudding against the marble, dragging her like a thief caught red-handed, her badge still dangling from her fingers, a useless shield against his rage, and papers fluttered from her satchel, case notes and schedules scattering like leaves in a storm, each one a testament to her legitimacy, her life's work, now trampled under his heavy tread, and she stumbled, her knee grazing the floor, pain flaring as marble bit into her skin, but she kept her voice steady. "This is harassment. Check the system." Her demand sharp, a lifeline hurled into the chaos, because she knew her clearance was ironclad, her title earned through sleepless nights and relentless grit, not handed to her like his privilege. Grayson's partner, Officer Dell, a wiry man with a patchy beard and a smirk tugging at his thin lips, stepped up, his uniform crisp but his posture slouched, casual in his cruelty. "She fits the profile," his lie oozing out, thick with racial venom, his dark eyes glinting as he nodded at Grayson, backing the charge with a flick of his bony hand, and Lena's stomach twisted, not from fear but from the sick familiarity of it. Profile, a code for her skin, her coils, her very existence in a space he thought she didn't belong. And he added, "Suspicious black female seen near secure files." His words a rehearsed script, dripping with the same hate she'd faced from cops pulling over her brother, her cousins, her neighbors, for nothing but breathing in the wrong zip code. And now it pinned her, her authority dissolving under their bias. The lobby's crowd thickened, lawyers pausing with coffee cups halfway to their lips, clerks clutching files like shields, their whispers a low hum. What's she done? Who is she? their curiosity a weight pressing on her shoulders. And a young clerk, Tia, her braids swinging as she edged closer, muttered, "That's Lena Harris, she runs records." Her voice a lifeline, but Grayson spun. "Shut it!" His snarl silencing her, his bulk overshadowing her slim frame, and Tia shrank back, her eyes wide, her protest swallowed, because his power, his whiteness trumped her truth, and Lena's heart sank because even allies faltered under his glare, leaving her alone in this storm. Grayson's meaty hand clamped tighter. "Move." His growl a shove in itself, hauling her toward the booking hall, the marble giving way to scuffed linoleum, the air growing colder, damper, as fluorescent tubes buzzed overhead, casting jagged shadows across his flushed face, and Dell trailed, his smirk widening. "Should have stayed in your lane," his taunter jab, because her badge, her title meant nothing to him, just a prop to mock, and Lena's feet slid, her heels scraping, but she locked her knees. "You're breaking protocol. I've got clearance." Her voice rising, a plea for reason in a tide of hate because she knew the system's rules, had mastered them to climb this high, and they were twisting them now, bending them to fit their bias, her first taste of how deep this racism ran, how it could strip her bare in a heartbeat. Grayson shoved her against a booking desk, the edge biting into her hip, pain flaring as papers skidded across the counter, and a grizzled desk sergeant, his badge reading Owens, glanced up, his grey eyes narrowing at her badge, then at Grayson. "What's this?" His gruff question a crack in the wall, and Lena seized it. "I'm Chief Clark, he's got no grounds." Her words a lifeline, but Grayson barked. "She's a thief," caught her red-handed, his lie bold, unwavering, and Dell nodded. "Saw her myself." His backup a steel trap, because their hate didn't need proof, just a nod, a wink, and her badge dangled. Useless, mocked by their sneers, and Owens frowned. "ID checks out." His doubt a flicker, but Grayson leaned close. "Check her bag," his whisper sinister, his hand still hovering, a threat unspoken, and Lena's breath hitched, because her authority, her life, meant nothing against their venom. And as Owens hesitated, Grayson's smirk grew. "She's done." His promise a noose tightening, because this wasn't just a clash, it was a war. Her first brutal lesson in how racism could cuff her, chain her, in a system she'd fought to serve. A war she'd wage with every breath because 32 years of grit had taught her to stand. Even now, even here, with cuffs biting her wrists, a fight just beginning against a cop who'd never let her win. The Atlanta precinct's dim booking hall buzzed with a stale hum as Lena Harris sat on a splintered bench, her wrists bruised and stinging beneath the cold steel cuffs, the air heavy with the sour tang of sweat and cheap disinfectant, her sleek blazer swapped for a rumpled shirt, coffee stains still clinging to the hem from Grayson's lobby assault, and her shoulders ached, a dull throb pulsing where he'd shoved her against the desk. But she kept her spine straight, her deep brown eyes fixed on the flickering fluorescent tubes overhead, their jittery glow casting jagged shadows across the scuffed linoleum floor, a testament to her resolve despite the chaos that had swallowed her day. Officer Carl Grayson lingered nearby, his hulking frame filling the narrow hall, his uniform crisp despite the sweat beading on his buzz-cut scalp, his pale grey eyes glinting with a mix of fury and unease as he paced, boots thudding against the worn tile, and Officer Dell hovered at his side, his wiry build slouched patchy beard framing a smirk that tugged at his thin lips, both of them whispering, their voices a low rumble lost in the precinct's drone. But Lena caught Grayson's glare, his meaty hand flexing as if aching to grab her again, because her badge, Chief Clark Harris, had shaken him, a black woman's power a crack in his brittle world, and he wouldn't let it stand unchallenged. The desk sergeant Owens, a grizzled man with a salt and pepper mustache and a creased brow, thumbed through her ID, his grey eyes narrowing as he tapped at a grimy keyboard, the clack of keys cutting through the hall's murmurs, and Lena's pulse steadied, her breath evening out. "Check my clearance, I'm legit," her voice firm, a lifeline she clung to, because 32 years of battling Atlanta's shadows had taught her to wield truth like a blade, and she watched Owens's frown deepen, his fingers pausing. "System says she's Chief Clark," his gruff admission a crack in the wall, and Grayson's jaw ticked, his flush darkening. But Owens nodded. "Uncuff her," his order a reluctant lifeline. and Lena's heart lifted, a flicker of triumph sparking, because her title, her badge might shield her yet, a win she could taste through the copper tang of her split lip. Del hesitated, his smirk fading, but Grayson growled, "Do it," his voice tight-clipped, and the cuffs clicked open, metal scraping as they fell away, leaving raw welts on her wrists, a stinging reminder of his hate, and Lena stood, rolling. Her shoulders file a report on him, harassment, her demand sharp, cutting through the precinct's haze, because this wasn't just a release, it was a chance to strike back, to hold him accountable, and she thought she'd won. Her authority, a hammer to crack his smug shell, her first step out of this nightmare, a victory forged from grit and proof. Owens nodded. "I'll log it," his tone grudging but steady, pulling a form from a cluttered stack, his pen scratching as he scribbled, and Lena's chest swelled, her breath easing, because Grayson's glare faltered, his meaty hand dropping. A crack in his armor she could widen, and she adjusted her torn blazer, smoothing the fabric, ready to walk out to reclaim her day, her life, from his racist grip. But Grayson's lips curled, a predator's grin spreading slow and sinister, and he stepped closer, his shadow swallowing her. Not so fast, his whisper a blade, and he slipped a small USB from his pocket, its black casing glinting as he tossed it into her open satchel, the soft thud a bomb in the silence, evidence tampering, his accusations swift, booming, turning Owens's nod into a scowl, and Lena's stomach dropped. "That's not mine." Her shout raw, desperate, because 32 years of clawing her way up couldn't shield her from this, his lie a noose tightening in an instant. Owens spun. "What's that?" His gruff question a hammer, and Grayson pointed. "Caught her planting it, check the logs." His voice slick, rehearsed, and Del chimed. "Saw her stash it." His lie a steel trap, his wiry frame stiffening, with mock urgency, because their hate didn't need truth, just a nod, a wink, and backup swarmed. Two more cops bursting from a side hall, their boots pounding, hands grabbing her arms, pinning her against the desk again, the edge bruising her. Hip anew, and Lena thrashed. "It's a setup," her voice rising, cracking the hall stillness, but Grayson loomed. "Got a witness?" His smirk widening as he nodded to a janitor, a wiry man with a grey cap lurking by the wall. "Saw her do it," the man muttered, his voice a bought tremble, his eyes darting away, bribed to bury her, and Lena's knees buckled, but she locked them. "He's lying." Her plea fierce, because her badge, her win, dissolved under their venom, a false victory snatched by. His desperate claw. The precinct's hum surged, cops circling, their radios crackling. "Book her again," Grayson's order a whip, and Owens frowned. "ID's real." His doubt a flicker, but Grayson barked. "Fake badge, check deeper." His lie bold, unwavering. And Del added, "She's been forging access." His backup a steel wall, because their racism didn't need proof, just a twist, a shove, and Lena's satchel spilled, papers fluttering, the USB gleaming like a planted seed, a trap she'd never sown, and Owens scowled, back in cuffs, his order reluctant, the steel snapping tight again, biting deeper, drawing a thin line of blood, and Grayson leaned close. "You're done." His whisper a promise, a threat, because her title, her truth, meant nothing against his hate, and cops dragged her down the hall, chains clanking, her heels scraping, the precinct's shadows swallowing her, because she'd thought she'd won, her badge a shield, her report a spear, but Grayson's lie flipped it, his desperation a noose slamming her back, her first brutal lesson in how racism could bury her, chain her, in a system she'd fought to serve. A war she'd wage with every breath, because 32 years of grit had taught her to stand. Even now, even here, with cuffs cutting her wrists, a fight just deepening against a cop who'd never let her rise. When victory turns to ash in a racist trap, where do you draw the line? Comment number 1 if you're raging at Grayson's dirty play, hit that like button, and subscribe for more stories of grit clashing with corruption. We're not letting this fade. Now, picture Lena facing a courtroom rigged to bury. Will her badge hold weight, or will Grayson's lies seal her fate? Stick around, the next twist is about to drop. The Atlanta courtroom pulsed with a humid noon haze as Lena Harris shuffled through its oak doors, her wrists raw from cuffs that had only just come off, now swapped for the stiff orange jumpsuit that clung to her sweat-damp skin, the fabric, rough against the bruises blooming across her ribs from Grayson's precinct shove, and her torn blazer was gone, replaced by this glaring mark of shame, her steps unsteady as the chains clinked against the polished hardwood floor, each sound a hammer blow echoing through the packed gallery where lawyers clutched briefcases, clerks whispered behind stacks of files, and cops in crisp uniforms lined the back, their eyes glinting with a smug certainty that twisted her gut. Judge Amos Reed loomed on the bench, a wiry white man with a hawkish nose and silver hair swept back, his black robe swallowing the light, his gavel resting heavy on its block like a loaded threat, and his pale blue eyes bore down on Lena, glinting, with a cold disdain that made her skin prickle. Because this wasn't just a judge, this was Grayson's crony, a fixture in Atlanta's courthouse who'd nodded at every cop's lie for decades, and now he held her fate, his presence a wall. She'd have to crack with nothing but her battered truth. The gallery buzzed, a sea of faces stretching to the walls, some craning necks, others muttering slurs under their breath. Thief, troublemaker. Their voices a low hum that pressed on her shoulders, and Lena's lawyer, Tate, a scrawny rookie with a mop of brown curls and a cheap grey suit, stood beside her, his hands trembling as he clutched a thin file, his Adam's apple bobbing as he faced Reed. "Your Honor, my client's innocent," his voice cracking under the judge's icy stare. And Lena's chest tightened, a flicker of hope sparking because Tate was green, nervous, but he'd fight. And she leaned close. "Tell him I'm chief clerk," her whisper urgent, because 32 years of clawing her way up had earned her that badge, a shield she'd wield even here, even now. Tate nodded. "She's Chief Clerk Harris, Your Honor, check her credentials." His plea thin but earnest, and a clerk, a young black woman named Jada with tight braids and a crisp blouse, stepped forward. "She's clean. I've worked with her." Her voice steady, a lifeline thrown into the storm, followed by another, an older man with a grey beard. "She runs records, no trouble." They're vouching a chorus cutting through the gallery's murmurs, and Lena's heart lifted, her breath easing, because her people, her work, might pull her through a wind she could taste through the stale air, her badge a hammer to crack this farce. And Reed paused, his gavel hovering, his lips pursed as if tasting doubt, freedom shimmering just beyond his silence, a chance to reclaim her life from Grayson's racist grip. But the courtroom doors banged open, Grayson storming in, his hulking frame filling the aisle, his uniform pristine despite the sweat beading on his flushed neck, his buzz cut gleaming under the lights, and he flashed a stack of papers. "Doctored. Logs, Your Honor," his voice booming, a fabricated thunderclap slapping them onto the evidence table with a thud that echoed off the oak walls. "She hacked our system, stole files," his lie slick, rehearsed, his pale grey eyes darting to Reed, a silent pact glinting between them, and Lena's stomach dropped. "That's a lie," her shout raw, cracking the room's tension, because those logs were his forgery, a desperate claw to bury her, and Tate fumbled, "Objection, no proof." His voice wobbling, his file slipping as he gestured, but Reed's gavel crashed, overruled, his snarl a blade, slicing Tate's plea, and Grayson smirked. Witness saw her tampering, his nod signaling a bribed guard, a wiry man with a patchy beard slinking forward, caught her in the act, his mutter a bought tremble, eyes fixed on the floor, and Lena's knees shook. He's paid off. Her cry fierce because her badge, her truth was dissolving under their venom, a wind snatched by his ambush. The jury, 12 tense faces in starched shirts and faded dresses, shifted, some nodding, others glaring, their eyes heavy with bias, and Reed leaned forward. "Guilty, 6 months." His verdict a thunderclap, no deliberation, no pause, his gavel slamming with a crack that rang in her ears, and cheers erupted from the gallery's cop corner. "Got her! Serves her right!" Their jeers a wave drowning Jada's choked gasp, and Lena's legs buckled, Tate catching her arm. "I'm sorry." His mutter lost as bailiffs grabbed her, chains rattling, dragging her toward the exit, the jumpsuit snagging on a bench, tearing a jagged hole, and she twisted, locking eyes with Grayson. "You'll pay." Her promise swallowed by the crowd's roar, because this wasn't justice. It was a lynching in robes, and Tate slumped. "We'll appeal," his voice feeble, papers scattering. But Reed smirked. "Take her away," his order final, and Lena stumbled into the hall, chains clanking, the precinct's echo fading, replaced by the courtroom's heavy oak doors slamming shut, a brutal hymn to a system Grayson owned, and her win, her badge, her fight crumbled. 6 months a noose around her neck. Her first brutal lesson in how racism's gavel could slam her down. A war she'd waged from the ashes, because 32 years of grit had taught her to rise, even now, even here, with chains biting her wrists, a fight deepening against a cop who'd never let her free. The Atlanta Women's Jail loomed under a blistering afternoon sun as Lena Harris stumbled from the transport van, its rusted doors screeching shut behind her, the air thick with the stench of diesel and despair, her orange jumpsuit chafing against. The raw welts on her wrists, the coarse fabric itching where sweat pooled beneath it, and her legs wobbled, bruised ribs pulsing with every jolting step across the cracked concrete yard. The 6-month sentence from Judge Reed's gavel still, ringing in her ears, a brutal echo of Grayson's courtroom trap, chaining her to this hellhole where the sky felt like a lid slamming shut. She shuffled through intake, a cavernous room with peeling grey paint and buzzing fluorescent strips, casting cold light on grim-faced guards, their boots scuffing the linoleum as they barked orders, stripping her of her last threads of dignity, tossing her a threadbare blanket that reeked of mildew, and a pair of socks so thin they'd tear by morning. And a hulking guard with a shaved scalp and a jagged scar twisting down his cheek leaned close, his badge reading Hicks, his breath sour with tobacco as he muttered, "Grayson's troublemaker, huh?" His words slithering into her ears, chilling her despite the sweat trickling down her spine. Because Grayson's reach had followed her, a venomous whisper poisoning even this concrete abyss, and Lena's jaw tightened. "I'm Chief Clerk." Her defiance sharp, but Hicks smirked. "Not here, you ain't," shoving her toward the key yard, a sprawling dust pit ringed by sagging chain link, crowned with coils of razor wire, where inmates milled, their eyes glinting with hunger, sizing her up like fresh meat on a butcher's block. The gate clanged shut, locking her in, dust sticking to her damp skin as she scanned the yard, the heat pressing down like a fist, and inmates closed in, a trio of women stalking forward, their leader, a stocky figure with a buzzed head and a scar slashing across her knuckles. Her fists clenched as she growled, "Heard you're Grayson's pet project," her voice a gravelly taunt, and Lena's stomach lurched because Hicks had spread his poison, painting her as a snitch or a target, and she squared her shoulders. "Don't want trouble," her tone steady, but the scarred woman laughed. A harsh bark, "Trouble's your shadow now," and swung, her fist slamming into Lena's cheek, the crack splitting the yard's dull roar, sending her reeling, blood welling hot in her mouth as pain flared across her face, and Lena stumbled. "Back off!" her shout raw, but the others pounced, one driving a heavy boot into her ribs, a sickening crunch ripping through her, and 32 years of scrapping in Atlanta's toughest corners kicked in, her fist flying, slamming the scarred woman's nose, cartilage crumpling with a wet snap, blood streaming down her chin as she howled, the thug staggering back, shock flashing in her muddy eyes, and Lena pivoted, ducking a wild swing from the second, a wiry woman with a tattoo curling up her neck, and she drove her elbow into the thug's gut, air whooshing out as the woman doubled over, and the third froze, hesitating, long enough for Lena to shove her hard, toppling her into the dust, kicking up a gritty cloud that stung her eyes. Oh, fleeting stand carved from grit and rage, because she wouldn't break, not here, not now. The yard hushed, inmates gaping, a grudging nod rippling through the crowd as the trio retreated, nursing their bruises, and Lena panted, wiping blood from her lip, thinking Defiance might carve her a sliver of respect, a shield in this pit, until Hicks strode over, his baton twirling, his smirk a slash of menace. "Told you she's trouble." His growl a whip, and he nodded to a wiry guard with a pinched face, who slipped a small baggie of white powder into her bunk, its plastic, glinting under the harsh lights. "Dealer," Hicks barked, his lie booming across the yard, and Lena's heart sank. "That's not mine." Her shout fierce, desperate, because 6 months was heavy, but this could chain her for years, and guards swarmed, pinning her arms, cuffs snapping tight again, biting deeper into her raw wrists, drawing a thin trickle of blood, and Hicks loomed. Add possession, 5 more years, his verdict a noose because Grayson's hate had stretched here, piling lies on lies, and the inmates' nods turned to sneers. Snitch and a junkie. Their whispers a tide burying her spark. A brutal lesson in how racism's claws sank deeper with every stand she made. Then a shadow slipped through. Ruby, a gaunt inmate with grey braids and tired eyes, her jumpsuit patched at the knees, kneeling beside Lena's bunk. "You're not alone." Her whisper soft, a lifeline in the storm, and she pressed a battered flip phone into Lena's palm. "Call out, quick!" Her hands trembling as she darted back, and Lena's chest swelled. "Thank you." Her gratitude raw, dialing her mom, Clara, her voice crackling through, "Lena, oh God." Her sob breaking the line, and Lena whispered, "Grayson's framing me, help." Hope surging as Clara promised, "I'll get someone." A thread, to pull her from this abyss. But footsteps pounded, Hicks charging back, his face twisted. "What's that?" Snatching the phone as Ruby spun. "It's mine." Her lie bold, but Hicks grabbed her, slamming her against the bunk, baton raining. "Blows?" Her cry sharp as blood bloomed on her cheek, and Lena lunged. "No!" Her shout useless. Chains yanking her back, and Hicks smashed the phone into shards, plastic crunching under his boot. "No lifelines, bitch." His snarl a death knell, kicking Ruby's crumpled form, her whimpers fading as guards dragged her off, leaving Lena kneeling in the dust, cheek pulsing, ribs screaming, because she'd fought, carved a stand, thought Ruby's gift might save her. But Grayson's shadow stretched crueler, deadlier, turning her spark into ash, and the yard's silence pressed down, inmates scattering, the air thick with blood, and loss, because 32 years of grit had taught her to rise. But this blow landed heaviest, a war deepening against a cop who'd never let her breathe. When defiance meets a racist cage, what's the cost of standing tall? Comment number 1 if you're gutted. Grayson's reach crushed Lena's fight. Hit that like button and subscribe for more raw tales of justice clashing with hate. We're in this together. Now, imagine Lena scratching her truth into Phil's cell wall. Will a spark ignite hope, or will Grayson's fire burn it out? Stay tuned, the next chapter's about to blaze. The Atlanta women's jail solitary cell pressed in on Lena Harris like a damp fist, its slick concrete walls glistening faintly under a single bulb's weak flicker, the air thick with the musty tang of mold and despair, her orange jumpsuit stiff with dried blood and sweat, clinging to the bruises mottling her cheek and the cracked ribs pulsing beneath her chest. And she slumped against the cold stone, her breath shallow, the ache a relentless drumbeat, as she traced a jagged crack beside her with a trembling finger. The sting of Ruby's beating still raw in her ears, a brutal echo of Grayson's reach locking her in this 6-month tomb, now stretched by Hicks's planted drugs, chaining her to years she didn't deserve. Her wrists burned where cuffs had bitten, the welts red and angry against her deep brown skin, and she scraped at the crack, her nail chipping as she carved a plea into the rough surface. "Grayson framed me." Each letter a jagged wound, her knuckles scraping bloody against the stone, a desperate flare etched in silence, because Ruby's shattered phone, her crumpled form, had lit a fire she wouldn't let die. And Lena's jaw tightened, her voice a hoarse whisper. Someone'll see. Her hope thin but fierce, because 32 years of clawing through Atlanta's shadows had taught her to fight when the world turned its back, even here, even now. Hours bled into a suffocating quiet, the bulb buzzing overhead, its sickly glow casting her shadow long and warped, and she nursed her ribs, each breath a sharp stab, until soft footsteps shuffled outside, a shadow pausing at the slot. Miss Fay, a stooped janitor with grey curls spilling from a faded cap, her lined face peering in, her eyes widening as she squinted at the scrawl, and Lena surged forward. "Miss Fay, look at the wall," her whisper urgent, slicing through the cell's stillness. And Fay froze, her gnarled hands clutching a broom, then leaned closer. "Lord, I heard about you," her voice trembling, because she'd swept these halls long enough to catch whispers of Grayson's hate, and she nodded. "I'll tell someone," her promise fragile but real, slipping a rag over the words. Memorizing them as she scrubbed, then shuffled off, her broom swishing to mask her haste, and Lena's chest swelled, a spark igniting, because Fay was her bridge, A crack in this jail's iron grip, a chance to claw her way out from Grayson's lies. Time stretched. The bulbs hum a relentless drone until the next dusk, when faint voices echoed beyond the cell, a TV blaring in the guard's lounge. Jamal, a gritty reporter with a voice like gravel, cutting through static. Chief Clerk, framed sources allege corruption. And Lena's bruised lips curved. Faye did it, her whisper triumphant. Because the story hit Atlanta's airwaves, protests erupting outside the jail gates, megaphones blaring, "Free Lena Harris," their chants rattling the razor wire, and she pressed her ear to the wall, the buzz of outrage seeping through, a lifeline she could almost touch, because the city was waking. Voices rising where hers couldn't, and she thought freedom might claw its way in, 6 months peeling back with every shout beyond the concrete. Then a bombshell landed. Sam, Grayson's jittery clerk, a lanky kid with nervous hands and a mop of blonde curls, cracked on air, his voice shaking through the TV's crackle. "He forged logs, paid me to swap 'em," and Lena's fist punched the air. Yes, her cry muffled but fierce, because Sam's confession was gold. Proof Grayson's empire was rotting, a spark fanning into flame, and she clung to the wall, ribs pulsing, thinking justice might bend, because protests swelled. Signs. Bobbing in sweaty crowds, her mom, Clara, on screen, pleading, "My girl's innocent," her voice a beacon piercing the dusk. And Lena whispered, "We're close," her hope surging because Faye's risk, Sam's crack, had lit a firestorm, Atlanta roaring where her strike had faltered, a chance to shatter Grayson's grip, to reclaim her life from his racist cage. But the cell's silence deepened, the guard's lounge falling quiet, and heavy boots stomped closer, a shadow filling the slot. Grayson himself, his hulking frame wedged in a suit, his buzz cut stark under the hall's harsh lights, his pale, grey eyes glinting with rage. "How you think you're slick?" His snarl low, venomous, and Lena's stomach plummeted, because he shouldn't be here, not in this pit, but he was, and she stood. "You're scared," her defiance a blade, because his presence meant the story stung. And Grayson smirked. "Scared? Nah, I run this city," his voice ice, turning as swiftly as he'd come, vanishing into the hall's gloom, leaving a chill in his wake. And minutes later, the TV blared again. Jamal's editor cutting in. Story retracted unverified claims, his tone flat, scripted, and Nola's fists clenched. He'd bottom, her realization bitter, because Grayson had stormed the newsroom, cash or threats silencing Jamal's. Fire, and Lena sank. "No," her whisper breaking because Sam's confession, the protests had roared loud, shaking Atlanta, a spark she'd tasted as victory, only for Grayson to douse it, his reach strangling truth, and he appeared again, peering through the slot. "You'll rot, no one gives a damn," his grin a slash of crooked teeth, and the door stayed shut, the bulb dimming as hope curdled. Because Faye's courage, Sam's leak had cracked the wall, only for Grayson's hate to seal it, his power a vice tighter than ever, and Lena's fingers brushed the scrawl. "Grayson framed me," still there, unseen now, useless, and she slumped beside it, ribs aching. "He's winning!" Her voice a thread, because 32 years of grit had taught her to rise. But this blow landed deeper, a war deepening against a cop who'd never let her breathe. A spark snuffed into ash, yet not dead, because Grayson's smirk, the retraction, hadn't killed her fight. They'd fueled it, sharpened it for a battle he couldn't foresee. The Atlanta women's jail simmered under a grey dawn haze as Lena Harris shuffled back into general population, the solitary cell's damp chill still clinging to her bones, her orange jumpsuit stiff with crusted blood and sweat, the bruises on her cheek throbbing a dull purple beneath her deep brown skin, and her cracked ribs pulsed with every shallow breath, the air thick with the sour tang of unwashed bodies and despair as she crossed the dusty yard. Inmates' eyes tracking her like vultures circling a wounded beast, their whispers a low hum that pressed on her shoulders, a grim chorus to the 6-month sentence Grayson's lies had stretched into years with Hicks's planted drugs. She limped toward her bunk, a sagging metal frame shoved against a cracked wall, its thin mattress stained with years of filth, her legs unsteady from the beating she'd taken, and the yard buzzed, a restless tide of orange figures pacing under. The flickering floodlights, their muttered slurs, "Snitch, trouble, a bitter echo of Grayson's venom seeping through the concrete, because his shadow lingered, a racist noose tightening even here, and Lena's jaw clenched, her fingers brushing the welts on her wrists, a stinging reminder of cuffs that had bitten deep. But she stood tall, 32 years of battling Atlanta's underbelly fueling her resolve even now, even broken. Then Officer Carl Grayson slunk in, his hulking frame dwarfing the narrow dorm entrance, his uniform crisp despite the sweat beading on his buzz-cut scalp, his pale grey eyes glinting with a predator's calm, and he tossed a small metal shank onto her bunk, its blade catching the light with a wicked gleam, the soft clink a bomb in the silence. "She attacked me," his staged cry booming across the dorm, clutching his arm where a fake gash oozed ketchup, a theatrical smear of red, against his sleeve, and Lena's stomach lurched. "That's not mine." Her shout raw, desperate, because 6 months was a wait, but this could bury her for a decade, and guards swarmed, their boots pounding, pinning her arms, cuffs snapping tight again, biting deeper into her raw wrists, drawing a fresh trickle of blood, and Grayson loomed. Add assault, 10 more years. His verdict a noose, his voice slick with glee because his hate didn't need proof, just a prop, a lie, and the inmates' murmurs turned to nods. She's done, their allegiance shifting, a brutal lesson in how racism's grip could pile. Years on years with a single flick of his wrist. Hicks, the scarred guard, smirked from the sidelines, twirling his baton. "Told you she's a problem." His taunt a whip, and Lena thrashed. "It's a setup," her voice cracking the dorm's haze. But the guards tightened their hold, her ribs screaming as they twisted her arms, and she rallied. "Strike with me." Her call hoarse, fierce, turning to the inmates. "They're screwing us all." Her plea a spark, and eyes flickered, some nodding, fists clenching, because Grayson's shadow stretched too far, and trays clattered untouched. A hunger strike blooming, day one stretching into two, the air thick with defiance, guards pacing, Hicks spitting curses. "You'll cave," his threat hollow as the strike held and news leaked, a contraband radio buzzing in a corner. "Jail revolt grows," Jamal's voice crackling through static, and Lena's chest swelled. "They're hearing us," her hope surging, because Atlanta's streets echoed, feds raiding the jail's gates, Grayson sweating on TV. No comment, his buzz cut gleaming with panic, and she thought justice might claw through, 16 years peeling back with every shout beyond the wire. A wind shimmering in the chaos, her fight fanning a city's fire. But Grayson struck, his grin a slash of menace as he slipped into the dorm on day 3, his hulking frame a storm cloud, whispering to Hicks, who planted a ketchup-soaked rag on a guard's bunk. "She stabbed him," Grayson's cry booming. A staged howl as he pointed at Lena, and Hicks bellowed, "Assault!" His lie a steel trap flipping the strike's tide, and inmates turned, their solidarity fracturing. "She's a rat!" a wiry woman hissed, fear snuffing out their spark. And a mob surged, fists flying, one slamming Lena's jaw, splitting her lip anew, blood streaming hot down her chin, and she swung back. "It's not true." Her shout lost in the roar, but another fist drove into her gut, air rushing out. As she crumpled, and a heavy boot cracked her ribs again, a sharp snap splitting the chaos, pain exploding white-hot, a scream tearing from her throat as she hit the dust, blood pooling beneath her, and Grayson watched. Let 'em rip. His laugh a blade because his lie, his ketchup smear, had turned allies into enemies, his desperation flipping defiance into despair, and guards smirked. "Finish her." Hicks's taunt a gut punch, stepping back as the mob closed in, a tattooed woman grabbing her hair, yanking her head back, a knee slamming her spine, and Lena, curled tight, arms shielding her face, blows raining down, her elbow pulsing where it had bruised before because she'd rallied, sparked a revolt, thought the feds might break Grayson's grip, but his revenge roared fiercer, deadlier, turning her stand into slaughter, and the yard settled, dust swirling, inmates retreating, their blood staining the concrete, guards looming. "Grayson owns you." Hicks's sneer a whip crack, and Lena's gasps rasped, blood dripping, ribs shattered anew, because 32 years of grit had taught her to rise, but this blow landed deepest, a war deepening against a cop who'd never let her breathe. A spark buried in agony, yet not dead, because Grayson's lie, the mob's fists, hadn't killed her fight. They'd fueled it, sharpened, it for a battle he couldn't foresee. When a spark of rebellion gets crushed by racist lies, how deep does the fight run? Comment number 1 if you're stunned. Grayson flipped Lena's strike into ruin. Hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of grit against the grind. We're not backing down. Now, envision a hidden ally stepping up. Will their truth break through, or will Grayson's wrath bury them too? Stay locked in, the next chapter's about to ignite. The Atlanta Women's Jail infirmary hummed with a sterile chill as Lena Harris lay sprawled on a sagging cot, her cracked ribs a throbbing cage beneath her sweat-soaked orange jumpsuit, the fabric patched with grime and clinging to the fresh bruises mottling her jaw from the mob's fury, and her busted elbow pulsed under a frayed sling, blood crusting her swollen lip, the air thick with the sharp tang of antiseptic and the faint rot of mildew seeping from cracked plaster walls. A grim echo of Grayson's strike, turning her hunger. Revolt into a bloody rout, chaining her 16 years deep in this hellhole, the weight of every blow a testament to his racist grip. A wiry figure slipped through the curtained doorway. Dr. Cole, a black ex-guard turned medic, his faded scrubs hanging loose on his lean frame, his dark eyes sharp behind smudged glasses, and he knelt beside her, stitching her ribs with steady hands, the needle tugging skin as she winced. Easy now, his voice low, gruff, but his touch gentle, threading silk through her torn flesh, and Lena's breath hitched. Thanks. Her gratitude raw because kindness was a ghost here, a flicker in the gloom, and Cole leaned closer. I know Grayson's dirt, his whisper urgent, cutting through the hum of a flickering bulb, and Lena's pulse quickened. You know him, her voice a mix of hope and suspicion, because 32 years of betrayal had taught her trust was a gamble, even in this pit. But Cole nodded. Busted his crew back when I wore a badge, he's filth. And Lena's chest tightened. Then help me. Her plea soft, desperate, because his words were a crack in the jail's iron shell, a spark after the mob's ashes, a chance to claw her way out from Grayson's lies. Cole pulled a file from his bag, pages creased and yellowed, edges curling like old scars. Found this in county archives, Grayson bribing cops to frame folks, goes back years. His fingers trembling as he handed it over, and Lena snatched it, her busted elbow protesting as she scanned lines of typed corruption, payments to Hicks, Dell, witnesses, names and dates, a map of his hate, and her ribs ached with every breath. This could free me. Her voice rising, fierce because it was gold, proof Grayson's empire wasn't just hers to topple. It was a system rotting at its core, and Cole nodded. I'll get it to a state probe, hold tight. His promise, a lifeline, slipping, out as quietly as he'd come, leaving her clutching the file, her bruised hands shaking with possibility, because after Grayson's shank, the mob's fists, this was a weapon, a chance to shatter 16 years with every page, to reclaim her life from his racist cage. Days crawled, the infirmary's hum a relentless drone until Atlanta buzzed, protests reigniting outside the jail's rusted gates, chants of end corruption rattling the razor wire, news vans choking the streets, their satellite dishes piercing the muggy dusk. And Lena grinned through her busted lip. Cole did it, her whisper triumphant as the TV in the guard's lounge blared, a state investigator's voice slicing static. We're digging into Officer Grayson, evidence points to misconduct, and her heart leapt. It's working, her hope surging, because the file had hit, the city roaring where her strike had bled, and inmates whispered, guards paced, Hicks spitting curses. Turn that off. His rage a sign they'd struck deep, and she thought freedom loomed, 16 years peeling back with every shout beyond the concrete. A wind shimmering in the chaos, her fight fanning a city's fire. Grayson's allies squirming on every screen. No comment. Their buzz cuts gleaming with sweat, a tide turning against his hate. But the air shifted, smoke curling under the infirmary door, a crackle swelling into a roar, and Lena coughed. What's that? Her eyes widening as flames licked the hall, the fire alarm screeching, and guards bolted shouting, Cole's car! Their boots pounding past, and she staggered up. No! Her cry raw, choking on smoke as the infirmary, blurred with orange and black, fire swallowing shelves, files, the truth Cole had unearthed, and Hicks loomed through the haze, grinning. Grayson says burn it. His taunt a gut punch, because he torched Cole's proof. But worse crashed in, sirens wailing as cops swarmed, dragging Cole from a side lot, his scrubs singed, his face bloody. "Drunk driver," they barked, cuffing him, and Lena's knees buckled. They framed him, her realization bitter, because Grayson hadn't just burned the file, he'd staged a crash, turned her ally into a scapegoat, and Hicks chuckled. "He's done," his laugh echoing as Cole vanished, hauled off in chains, leaving Lena gasping in the wreckage, elbow pulsing, ribs screaming, because Cole's dig, his risk, had lit Atlanta ablaze, only for Grayson to flip it, his hate roaring fiercer, deadlier, torching her spark, burying truth with a body, and the infirmary smoldered. Guards sneering, "Back to your hole," their boots kicking ash, and she sank. "He's gone," her whisper breaking, because 32 years of grit had taught her to rise. But this blow landed heaviest, a war deepening against a cop who'd never let her breathe. A flame snuffed into ruin, yet not dead, because Grayson's fire, Cole's blood, hadn't killed her fight. They'd fueled it, sharpened it for a battle he couldn't foresee. The Atlanta women's jail yard crackled with a restless dusk heat as Lena Harris limped back into general population, her cracked ribs a jagged ache beneath her sweat-drenched orange jumpsuit, the fabric patched with grime and clinging to the fresh bruises mottling her jaw, blood crusting her swollen lip from the mob's savage turn, and her busted elbow throbbed under a frayed sling. The air thick with the sour tang of unwashed bodies and the faint smoke still lingering from Cole's torched truth. Her 16-year sentence a brutal weight Grayson's lies had forged, chaining her to this hellhole where the sky loomed like a steel trap, unyielding and cruel. The yard buzzed, inmates pacing like caged beasts under flickering floodlights, their eyes glinting with a raw fury sparked by Dr. Cole's framed crash, his bloodied scrubs a ghost haunting their whispers. "They'll kill us all." There, rage a tide swelling against the concrete walls, and Lena's jaw tightened, her fingers brushing the welts on her wrists, a stinging reminder of cuffs that had bitten deep. But she stood tall, 32 years of battling Atlanta's shadows, fueling her resolve even now, even broken, because Cole's fall had cracked something. A fault line trembling through this pit, ready to burst. Then it erupted, a scream slicing the dusk. They framed Doc, an inmate's cry igniting the yard, and chaos roared, women surging, trays crashing, fists smashing guard posts, the din swallowing the hum of cicadas beyond the razor wire. And Lena seized it, spotting a guard's radio dangling from Hicks's belt as he wrestled an inmate, her hand darting out, snatching it, the plastic slick with sweat. And she bolted. "Cover me!" Her shout sharp, hoarse as she weaved through the fray, ribs screaming with every step, because 20 years of scrapping had taught her to grab chances, even bleeding, even here. And she pressed the button. Voice crackling over static. "This is Lena Harris. Grayson framed me." Her words a flare, broadcasting beyond the walls, a desperate plea piercing the night, and inmates rallied, shielding her, fists swinging at guards. "Keep her clear." Their shouts a chorus, because Cole's ruin had lit this fire, and now her voice fanned it, freedom shimmering on the horizon, a spark she could taste through the copper in her mouth. Atlanta's streets erupted, protesters flooding the jail gates, horns blaring. "Free Lena Harris," their chants shaking the chain link, news vans clogging the city, Jamal's voice booming again. Jail riot escalates over corruption claims. And Lena's chest swelled. They're listening. Her hope surging because Cole's files, her radio cry, had pulled feds crashing in, their vans screeching up, agents spilling out, hands off, their orders cutting through. Hauling Hicks back, his baton clattering, and Grayson's hulking frame flickered on a TV screen. No comment. His buzz cut gleaming with sweat, panic etching his pale gray eyes. And Lena thought, "We've got him." Her breath ragged, because the city's roar, her stand, meant justice. 16 years peeling back, a win carved from chaos, her fight breaking his grip at last. But Grayson struck, his voice snarling over a hacked jail PA, a doctored clip of Lena. "I'm a terrorist, I'll bomb this place." Her confession, slick, fake, booming through the yard's speakers, twisting her cry into guilt, and Lena's heart sank. He faked it. Her whisper lost as inmates froze, their fury flipping. "She's a liar." A stocky woman spat, fists turning on her, and the tide shifted, rioters storming her corner. A heavy fist slamming her cheek, blood streaming fresh down her chin, and she swung back. "It's not me!" Her plea drowned by shouts. A boot cracking. Her ribs again. A sickening snap splitting the chaos, pain exploding white-hot, a gasp tearing from her throat as she hit the dust, and Grayson's squad swarmed, his hulking frame looming. "Teach her," his order a whip, guards piling on, fists pounding her back, ribs shattering anew under their blows. "Stay down." Hicks's snarl a blade, because his lie, his bomb threat, had flipped rebellion into ruin, his desperation turning allies into enemies. And the yard spun, smoke swirling from tear gas canisters, inmates scattering, their blood staining the concrete. A brutal hymn to a system he owned, and Lena curled tight, arms shielding her face, blows raining down, her elbow pulsing where it had broken before, because she'd broadcast truth, sparked. A riot thought feds might shatter Grayson's grip, but his wrath roared fiercer, deadlier, twisting her stand into agony, and guards laughed. She's done. Their boots kicking dust, and her gasps rasped, blood pooling beneath her. Because 32 years of grit had taught her to rise, but this blow landed deepest. A war deepening against a cop who'd never let her breathe, a spark buried in torment, yet not dead, because Grayson's lie, the guards' fists, hadn't killed her fight. They'd fueled it, sharpened it for a battle he couldn't foresee. When a cry for justice turns to chaos in a racist snare, how much can one soul endure? Comment number 1 if you're reeling from Grayson's terror trap, crushing Lena's riot. Hit that like button and subscribe for more raw battles against corruption. We're standing with her. Now picture a retrial looming. Her badge. In play, will it break Grayson's hold, or will his lies bury her deeper? Don't blink, the next clash is about to unfold. The Atlanta courthouse simmered under a thick noon haze as Lena Harris shuffled through its heavy oak doors. Her cracked ribs a jagged ache beneath the stiff orange jumpsuit, patched with grime and clinging to the fresh bruises mottling her jaw from the riot's brutal turn, blood crusting her swollen lip, and her busted elbow throbbed under a frayed sling. Her steps unsteady from the mob's blows, chains clinking against the polished hardwood floor, each sound a grim echo of Grayson's lies, chaining her to 16 years in a jail hellhole, the air thick with the stale tang of wood polish and tension as she faced a retrial, a desperate bid to claw back her life from his racist grip. The courtroom buzzed, a packed sea of faces stretching to the walls, reporters scribbling on pads, their pens scratching like ants on bark, protesters' chants filtering through tall windows. Free Lena Harris. A restless hum, shaking the Glass and Clara, Lena's mom, stormed through the gallery, her wiry frame clad in a navy dress, her hands clutching Lena's badge, its gold gleaming under the flickering fluorescence. "She's Chief Clark," her shout slicing the din, thrusting it toward Judge Ellis, a stern black woman with gray-streaked hair and a robe that hung heavy, her dark eyes narrowing as she leaned forward, gavel poised, a new face free of Grayson's taint, and Lena's chest tightened. "Mom," her whisper trembling, because Clara's fire, her badge, was a shield she'd never dared hope for. 32 years of grit, meeting a mother's fury in this crucible of hate. Clara faced Ellis. "My daughter's legit, check it," her voice a thunderclap, badge held high, and Lena's lawyer Tate, a scrawny rookie with a mop of brown curls and a rumpled grey suit, stood beside her, his hands steadier now, clutching, a file thick with notes. "Your Honor, she's Chief Clark Harris, framed by Officer Grayson," his plea firm, cutting through the gallery's murmurs, and feds flanked the aisle, their navy jackets crisp, presenting Cole's charred file, its edges blackened but pages intact. "Bribes, forgery, it's all here." An agent's voice sharp, a lifeline salvaged from the infirmary's ashes, and Lena's heart leapt. "It's working." Her hope surging because her badge, her mom, the feds, were cracking Grayson's wall, 16 years teetering with every word. A wind shimmering beyond the chaos, her fight piercing his racist cage at last. Ellis nodded. "Officer Grayson testify." Her order a hammer, and Grayson swaggered in, his hulking frame filling the witness box, his uniform pristine despite the sweat beading on his buzz-cut scalp. his pale grey eyes glinting with a predator's. Calm, caught mid-trial as he dodged every probe. "She's legit," his voice tight, squirming under Ellis's gaze, and Lena's breath eased. "He's cracking," her whisper fierce, because his admission, forced by Clara's badge, the Fed's proof, had jurors shifting. 12 tense faces in faded shirts and stiff collars wavering, doubt creasing their brows, and Tate pressed. He planted evidence, torched files, his questions blades, slicing Grayson's calm, and the gallery buzzed. "He's guilty." A tide turning, because Cole's file, her mum's stand, were peeling back years, her badge a hammer shattering his throne, and Ellis leaned closer. "Explain this," her tone iron, and Lena thought. "We're free," her pulse racing, because truth was clawing through, acquittal looming beyond this gavel, a chance to reclaim her life from his hate. But Grayson grinned, a predator's gleam flashing across his crooked teeth, slipping an eyes note to a bailiff mid-trial, his whisper lost in the chaos, and minutes later, sirens wailed outside. A panicked voice crackling over the PA. She confessed, stole files. A fake video booming through speakers, Lena's voice warped. "I tampered with evidence." His forgery slick, a desperate claw flipping the courtroom, and panic surged. Jurors scrambling, benches toppling, reporters shouting, "She's a crook." Their pens dropping as fear swallowed truth, and Lena's stomach plummeted. "No!" her cry raw, because Clara's badge, the Fed's file, were crumbling, and Grayson barked, "Double her sentence." His order a gavel's echo. No vote. No pause, and Tate shouted, "It's fake," his voice wobbling, file slipping as he flailed. But Ellis's frown deepened. "Order." Her gavel crashing, swayed by the lie, and Feds hesitated. "Verify it," an agent muttered, radios buzzing. Doubt creeping in, because Grayson had bribed a juror, planted the video, turned justice into chaos, and bailiffs swarmed, yanking Lena up, chains clanking, her sling snapping loose, elbow jolting, pain searing white-hot, and Clara lunged. "She's innocent!" Her cry lost as guards hauled her back, and Grayson smirked. "Life now!" His verdict a noose, because his lie, his bribe, had flipped her win, his desperation slamming her back into Max, and Tate slumped. "We'll fight," his mutter feeble, papers scattering. But Ellis barked, "Take her." Her order final, and Lena stumbled into the hall, chains rattling, the courtroom's oak doors slamming shut, a brutal hymn to a system he owned, and her badge, her mum's fire, dissolved, life looming heavier than ever. A war deepening against a cop who'd never let her breathe, a spark buried in torment yet not dead, because Grayson's lie, the guard's grip, hadn't killed her fight. They'd fueled it, sharpened it for a battle he couldn't foresee. The Atlanta dusk hung heavy with a muggy stillness as Officer Carl Grayson paced his cramped precinct office, his hulking frame dwarfed by the flickering fluorescent lights, his uniform discarded for a wrinkled jacket, sweat beading on his buzz cut, scalp despite the chill creeping through cracked windows, and his pale grey eyes glinted with a predator's desperation, his suspension a noose tightening after Lena's retrial bared his lies, protesters still chanting beyond the courthouse. Justice for Harris. Their drums a relentless pulse he couldn't silence. So he gripped a burner phone, barking into it, "Take out Clara Harris tonight." His voice a low growl, because Lena's mom, her badge-waving fire in court, had cracked his empire, and he'd lost too much, his badge teetering, his power. Fraying, hiring a hitman. A lean shadow with a scarred jaw to bury her in her Atlanta home, a knife to her throat. Because life in jail wasn't enough for Lena, he needed blood to end this war. In the jail's max security wing, Lena slumped against a cold steel bunk, her cracked ribs a jagged ache beneath her orange jumpsuit, soaked with sweat and patched with grime, blood crusting her swollen lip from the riot's brutal turn, and her busted elbow pulsed under a frayed sling, the air thick with the sour tang of rust and despair, her chains clanking as she shifted, 16 years now, a life sentence under Grayson's forged video, and a guard slipped a note through the slot. "Clara's in danger," scrawled in shaky ink, and Lena's breath caught. "Mum." Her whisper trembling, because Clara's courtroom stand, her badge, had lit this fight, and now Grayson's. Claws reached her, a shadow she'd never outrun, and Lena stood. "I'm breaking out." Her plan a desperate spark, because 32 years of grit screamed to save her mom, even here, even broken. She scanned the cell, spotting a laundry cart rolling past, its wheels squeaking. A chance in the dark, and she pried at a loose vent grate, metal groaning as it gave, her ribs protesting with every twist, and she crawled, dust choking her lungs. Elbow jolting, pain searing, but she pushed. Clara's blood calling her, dropping into a service hall where a truck idled, and Lena hotwired it, her hands steady despite the ache, wires sparking as the engine coughed alive. "Move!" her shout. A prayer, because 16 years' life meant nothing if Clara bled out, and she floored it. Crashing a checkpoint gate, sirens blaring, bullets pinging off metal, ribs pulsing with every jolt, racing through Atlanta's backroads, tires screeching on asphalt, sweat stinging her eyes. "Hold on, Mom." Her vow fierce, because she'd thought Clara's stand might free her. Now she'd save her. Life sentence be damned. The truck screeched into Clara's quiet street. Dusk fading to night, abandoning it in an alley. Lena limping, her jumpsuit torn, blood seeping through the sling. And she slipped past a neighbor's fence, the tang of fresh-cut grass sharp. Up Clara's porch steps, her door ajar, heart pounding as she peeked. "Mom." Her whisper breaking, seeing Clara bound in her kitchen, a wiry hitman with a scarred jaw pressing a knife to her throat, his blade glinting under the dim bulb. And Clara's navy dress was crumpled, her eyes wide. "Lena," her gasp a lifeline, and Lena tackled him, her grazed elbow slamming his wrist, the knife slashing her arm, blood gushing hot as she roared, pain exploding, and she pinned him. "Get off her!" Her cry raw, thinking Clara was safe, her Mom's pulse steady beneath her grip, a desperate stand carved from love and fury, because 32 years of surviving had taught her to fight, even bleeding, even here. The hitman thrashed. "Grayson owns you," his snarl a blade, swinging. The knife back, but Lena twisted, kicking his knee. Bone crunching as he stumbled, the blade clattering, and she thought she'd won. Clara's ropes loosening, her mum's gasp free, until boots pounded outside, Grayson's squad bursting in, crooked cops in black vests, guns blazing, bullets, tearing plaster, and Lena dove. Down! Her shout sharp, shoving Clara behind the counter, her arm pulsing as blood soaked the floor, and a shot ripped Clara's leg, crimson pooling fast, her scream slicing the night. "No," Lena's cry breaking because she'd escaped, reached her, thought her fight might shield her mom, only for Grayson's claws to strike fiercer, deadlier, turning rescue into carnage. Cops swarmed. "You're done," one barked, guns leveling, and Lena lunged, fists flying, slamming a cop's jaw, blood spraying as he reeled, but they piled on, knees pinning her, cuffs snapping tight, biting deeper into her raw wrists, drawing. A fresh trickle, and Grayson loomed, his hulking frame a storm. Should have stayed caged. His smirk a slash of menace, his squad dragging Clara out, her leg bleeding, moaning, "Lena!" Her voice fading, and Lena thrashed, "Let her go!" Her shout useless, ribs cracking anew under their blows, because Grayson's hit, his cops had flipped her stand into slaughter, and they hauled her off, chains clanking. Clara's blood staining her hands. "I'll get you," her vow ragged, because 32 years of grit had taught her to rise. But this blow landed heaviest, a war deepening against a cop who'd never let her breathe, a spark buried in agony, yet not dead, because Grayson's guns, Clara's wound, hadn't killed. Her fight, they'd fueled it, sharpened it for a battle he couldn't foresee. The Atlanta night pulsed with a muggy dread as Lena Harris crouched behind Clara's kitchen counter, her cracked ribs screaming beneath her blood-soaked orange jumpsuit, the fabric patched with grime and clinging to the fresh bruises mottling her jaw, her busted elbow throbbing under a shredded sling, and her arm pulsed where the hitman's knife had slashed. Blood dripping onto the linoleum, mixing with Clara's crimson pool, her mum's leg a mangled mess from Grayson's squad's gunfire, her shallow breaths rattling as Lena shielded her, pressing a torn dishcloth to the wound. "Hold on, Mum," her voice a raw plea, because Clara's life, her fire, was bleeding out. A mother she'd fought to save now fading in her arms, and the stolen gun trembled in her free hand, its grip slick with sweat and blood, a desperate shield against the cops closing in, their black vests glinting under the kitchen's dim bulb, the air thick with the acrid tang of gunpowder, and the copper stench of despair, bullets tearing plaster as Grayson's final play turned rescue into ruin, chaining her to 16 years stretched to life, a brutal weight she'd never outrun. She fired, the gun bucking, rounds pinging off a fridge, clipping a cop's shoulder. Crimson spraying as he yelped, "She's armed!" His shout sharp, and Lena's ribs flared with every shot. "Back off!" Her cry fierce, hoarse, because 32 years of grit screamed to protect Clara, even here, even bleeding. And cops ducked, returning fire, bullets shredding cabinets, glass shattering as she yanked Clara lower, her mom's groan faint. "Lena!" Her whisper a thread, and Lena thought they'd hold. Her stand, her gun might save her yet because she'd broken out. Reached her. Defied Grayson's hitman, a spark carved from love and fury in this hellish night. But chaos roared, cops pressing, a bullet grazing Lena's thigh, blood blooming hot, and she gritted her teeth. "Keep going," her defiance iron, firing again, the gun clicking empty, and she scrambled, snatching a fallen knife from the hitman's clutch, slashing a cop's calf as he lunged. His howl sharp as he crumpled, blood pooling, and feds swarmed in, alerted by a neighbor's frantic call. Their navy jackets a blur. "Drop your weapons," their shouts slicing the din, hauling cops back, cuffs snapping. "You're done," an agent barked, pinning the hitman, his scarred jaw bruised from Lena's tackle, and Lena's chest heaved. "We made it," her whisper breaking because Clara's pulse faint but there, and the feds meant rescue. Grayson's empire cracking, a win she could taste through the copper in her mouth. 16 years, life peeling back with every shout. Beyond the kitchen's wreckage, her fight breaking his grip at last. But a crack split the air. A sniper's shot from a rooftop perch, the bullet ripping through Lena's knee. A white-hot explosion shattering bone, dropping her limp beside Clara. Blood pooling fast, her legs numb, her scream swallowed by pain. As it engulfed her, and Clara gasped, "No!" Her cry raw, lunging to cradle her daughter, the knife clattering useless, her hands pressing Lena's wound. "Stay with me." Her plea ragged. Because 32 years of twin battles, their unbreakable bond teetered on this edge, and feds spun. Shooter, high ground, guns swinging, firing at shadows, bullets pinging off steel, but the sniper vanished. A ghost in Grayson's pay, his final card, and Lena's vision blurred. "Mom," her voice fading, eyes fluttering, because she'd fought, saved Clara, thought feds would end it. And agents shouted, "Medic now," their kits clanking, dragging the hitman out, his laugh chilling. "Grayson says you're finished," his taunt a blade, because her stand, her fire, had cracked Grayson's grip, only for his sniper to strike fiercer, deadlier, turning victory into torment, and guards loomed. "She's still a threat," Hicks's snarl a whip, stepping back as feds swarmed. "Clear," their order hollow as medics rushed Lena. "Knees gone, critical!" Their voices sharp, lifting her onto a stretcher, blood dripping, her eyes locked on Clara's, a silent vow, and Clara staggered up. "My girl," her sob breaking, leg bleeding as medics pressed it. "She's alive," their urgency a blur, and Lena's gasps rasped, knee shattered, ribs pulsing, because 32 years of grit had taught her to rise. But this blow landed deepest, a war deepening against a cop who'd never let her breathe. A spark buried in agony yet not dead, because Grayson's sniper, Clara's wound, hadn't killed her fight. They'd fueled it, sharpened it for a battle he couldn't foresee. The Atlanta hospital's sterile hush wrapped around Lena Harris as she jolted awake on a stiff bed, her knee a numb void below a thick cast, legs lifeless under a thin gown clinging to her sweat-damp skin, her cracked ribs a jagged ache beneath. Fresh bandages and blood crusted her swollen lip, the air thick with the sharp tang of antiseptic and the faint hum of monitors beeping, their green lines spiking erratically, casting a sickly glow across her bruised face, while Clara lay in the next bed, her legs swathed in gauze, her wiry frame still, breath shallow but steady, alive despite the bullet's tear. And feds swarmed the room, their navy jackets rustling, an agent muttering, "Grayson's probe's live, he's cornered," his voice sharp, because the sniper, the hitman, had cracked his empire, and Lena's chest tightened. "We survived," her whisper trembling, because 32 years of grit, their kitchen stand, had pulled them through. 16 years stretched to life teetering, freedom shimmering in the chaos. The TV flared, Grayson on screen, cuffed in a precinct hall. His hulking frame slumped, his buzz cut stark under harsh lights. "He's finished," an anchor's voice booming. "Corrupt cop down." And Atlanta erupted, protests morphing to cheers beyond the hospital's glass. Justice for Lena. A tide washing away years, but a bombshell dropped. Clara stirred, her hands clutching a hidden locket, trembling as she locked eyes with Lena. "I've kept something." Her tone steady, a storm brewing, and Lena frowned. "Mom," her voice soft, wary, because Clara's face held shadows, a secret buried deep, and she clicked it open, a photo spilling out. A girl's face, Jade, wide-eyed and young. "She's alive." Clara's revelation a thunderclap, and Lena's breath caught. "Jade," her whisper breaking, because 16 years ago she'd thought her sister lost to a car crash, a grief she'd carried silently, and Clara's eyes welled. "I hid her," Grayson knew, her confession raw, because she'd fled with Jade, shielded her from a cop's wrath after Lena's rise, a daughter Lena never knew survived, and now, Grayson's taunt on the news. "Your sister's next," aimed at Jade. Unburied a leverage he'd held all along, and Lena's stomach sank. "She's out there," her realization bitter, because 32 years of fighting had forged this family, only to crack it open with this truth. A shadow deeper than Grayson's hate. Feds pounced. "We'll find her," an agent barked, radios buzzing, but the screen flared again. Prison riot at max. Grayson escaped, the anchor's voice sharp, cutting through their fragile win, and Lena's blood chilled. "No." Her cry raw, because life had loomed, freedom had bloomed, only for Grayson to slip free, his last words echoing. "Your sister's next." A taunt aimed at Jade, a girl unseen, alive. And Clara paled. "He knows where she is." Her whisper, haunted, eyes darting to Lena, because 16 years ago she'd cut ties, hid Jade in Savannah, never dreaming Grayson's reach could stretch that far, and now his escape turned it loose, a ghost unburied, and Lena's fists clenched. "What's he got?" Her demand a blade, because her badge, her fight had freed her, only to birth this, a war reborn in a sister's shadow, and feds scrambled. "He's armed, dangerous," their urgency a blur, but the hospital pulsed, colder, darker, because Lena's knee, Clara's leg, were prices. Paid, a wind snatched, and Grayson's flight flipped it, his knowledge a noose tightening, and Clara sank. "I thought she was safe," her voice trembling, because she'd raised Lena, fought for her, thought this was the end, but his escape, Jade's life, turned victory to ash, and Lena wheeled closer. "I'll find her," her vow fierce, her fight reborn, because Grayson's hate, his sniper, had crippled her, but not her spirit, and the room hummed, monitors beeping, feds shouting. "Lock it down," their orders sharp, and Clara gripped her hand. "She's yours." Her eyes wet, because she'd hidden Jade, shielded her, thought this war was won, but Grayson's shadow stretched cruelest, deadliest, and Lena stared. "He's not done," her voice hollow, because 32 years of grit had taught her to rise, but this twist landed heaviest. A sister lost, now found, a threat unburied in a cop's escape, a war deepening beyond these walls, a spark blazing anew against a foe who'd never let her rest. Lena Harris's harrowing journey through Atlanta's corrupt gauntlet teaches us that justice is a brutal uphill climb, not a given, forged through relentless grit against a tidal wave of racial hate. From a courthouse shove to a sniper's bullet shattering her knee, her story exposes how prejudice turns power into a weapon, with Officer Carl Grayson wielding lies, forged logs, planted shanks, fake confessions, to chain her, a black woman, despite her chief clerk badge. Every stand, from prison riots to courtroom clashes, shows resilience isn't just enduring. It's fighting back when ribs crack, when family bleeds, when hope burns to ash. Clara's badge, Cole's file, reveal allies as lifelines, yet fragile. Snuffed by Grayson's ruthless torch, a lesson in how racism escalates, striking deadlier with every crack it faces. His escape, Jade's unburied life, prove evil doesn't yield, it twists, hitting harder when cornered. 16 years ballooning to life, a sister's safety, now a noose. Lena's fight screams that justice demands more than one voice. It needs a chorus like Atlanta's protests to shatter corruption's grip, because a badge means nothing when hate owns the gavel. Her wheelchair vow, Jade's shadow, show change starts with those who rise even broken, against a system that thrives on silence. When hate turns victory to dust, what keeps the fire alive? Comment. Number 1. If Lena's unbreakable spirit fuels your fight for justice, like, subscribe and share to amplify this battle cry. Your voice matters. Thanks for standing with us through this raw saga. Your support lights the truth's path. Here's wishing you the strength to face your own. Graysons, may you rise unshattered always.